Human trafficking is a pervasive human rights issue affecting millions, no matter their gender, age, or nationality.
Today we're gathered together for a truly important mission, ending the scourge of human trafficking.
A deadly shooting in Minneapolis triggered a wave of unrest that spread across the country. More than 1,000 protests erupted nationwide after a federal immigration operation ended with a single gunshot. During a confrontation involving a vehicle, an ICE agent fired his weapon. A local woman was killed. Federal authorities immediately labeled the incident self-defense. The public response was instant and explosive. That bullet did not end the story. It cracked it open. As demonstrations flooded city streets, the Department of Homeland Security announced a major escalation. 10,000 additional Border Patrol officers and federal agents were ordered into Minneapolis. Protests intensified across the Twin Cities and beyond. Sirens echoed through neighborhoods. Crowds swelled by the hour. What began as outrage over one death rapidly transformed into something far more volatile. After January 7, 2026, Minneapolis was no longer recognizable. Once known as a quiet Midwestern city, it entered a period of instability unmatched in modern times. Streets residents walked daily turned into battlegrounds of chanting crowds and confrontations that lasted through the night. Fires burned. Windows shattered. The sound of helicopters became constant. The shooting that killed Renee Good had happened only days earlier, but its impact stretched far beyond the incident itself. DHS began deploying hundreds more federal agents into Minnesota as violent anti-ICE protests spread statewide. Within just 10 days, officials confirmed the arrival of more than 10,000 federal personnel. The force was larger than the combined police departments of many mid-sized American cities. Resistance followed immediately. Specialized federal units faced organized pushback. Barricades appeared overnight. Coordinated attacks broke out across multiple locations. By the end of the second week, 34 people were dead. Online activity exploded. Engagement surged nearly 190% across platforms such as Twitter and YouTube. Videos, rumors, and conspiracy theories flooded timelines, amplifying fear and confusion. But amid the chaos, something else was happening. Local parents began reporting children missing. Not hours, days. Some families filed reports repeatedly. Others said their cases vanished into bureaucratic confusion. Approximately 31 disappearance reports were either ignored or lost entirely as law enforcement struggled to manage citywide unrest. Desperate parents marched through major avenues holding photos, shouting names, demanding answers no one could give. Behind closed doors, federal investigators from the FBI and Immigration and Customs Enforcement noticed patterns that did not fit a spontaneous uprising. The timing was too precise. The violence too coordinated. The distractions too effective. What looked like disorder was masking something deliberate. Analysts began to suspect that the protests were not just unrest, but cover. A smokescreen designed to conceal a massive criminal operation moving in real time. Internal briefings raised an alarming possibility: a human trafficking network valued at nearly $1 billion, using the city's collapse to erase its trail. Quiet conversations inside federal command centers revolved around a single question that refused to fade. Was the unrest being steered by someone with real power? As chants echoed through neighborhoods and emergency lights painted buildings red and blue, very few outside intelligence circles understood what was unfolding. The riots were not the cause of the crisis. They were the distraction. And while the city burned, something else continued uninterrupted. Behind the chaos stood a figure almost no one suspected. Judge Hassan Dul, 44 years old. Somali American. Known for discipline, precision, and 7 consecutive years on the bench. Within legal circles, his reputation was spotless. He was considered fair, methodical, consistent. Parents trusted him. Defense attorneys respected him. Defendants feared his courtroom. That image was not accidental. It was protection. Federal investigators would later conclude that the riots posed no threat to his operation. They fueled it. While police resources were overwhelmed and public focus remained locked on the streets, the judge activated a network he had quietly built over nearly a decade. Behind sealed doors and encrypted files, agents uncovered a structure that had grown undetected for years. A trafficking and narcotics empire approaching $1 billion in value. At its core were more than 200 vulnerable individuals. Men, women, children, all pushed into exploitation through poverty, debt, or coercion. Among them were 20 U.S. citizens recruited intentionally to manage logistics, documentation, and transportation. Their presence provided a domestic shield, complicating jurisdiction and delaying detection. The network was global. From Minneapolis, people and drugs moved through intermediaries to China, India, and Myanmar. The pipeline transported human beings alongside narcotics. Seized records revealed annual movement exceeding 4.3 tons of drugs, including heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. The estimated street value reached hundreds of millions of dollars each year. Money never traveled in large transfers. It was divided, layered, and recycled through shell accounts across 3 continents. Transactions were small enough to bypass audits, small enough to avoid alarms, invisible by design. At least 17 officials were identified as complicit. Port authorities approved unchecked customs documents. Financial administrators rerouted illicit funds. Intermediaries enforced silence with payments or threats. Corruption stretched far beyond the streets. Then investigators found something worse. Beneath the judge's private residence, hidden behind reinforced concrete and false walls, lay a structure built with purpose. Not an improvised space. Not a tunnel dug in panic. This was engineered. Ventilation systems, lighting, soundproofing, detention chambers. This was where people were held. This was where drugs were stored. This was where operations disappeared. 4 federal teams, the conclusion became unavoidable. The riots were not random. They were cover. Weaponized chaos, deployed by someone who understood power, patience, and the advantage of legal authority. By the time the city realized what had been hidden beneath it, the machinery was already moving. Before dawn, federal commanders reached a decision. This operation could not be dismantled quietly. At 4:30 a.m., under citywide curfew, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs moved through side streets with headlights off. No sirens. No warning. Inside were more than 300 ICE and DHS tactical agents, supported by investigators who had tracked the network for months. Every second mattered. Intelligence warned that evidence, money, and people could vanish within minutes if even one alert was triggered. The target was a private residence that blended seamlessly into the neighborhood. No signs. No security visible from the street. When the first door was breached, silence shattered. Armed guards opened fire almost instantly. The exchange was violent and brief. Flashbangs detonated. Commands echoed through the house. Within 90 seconds, resistance on the upper floors collapsed. Several suspects were wounded. No one escaped. But the house was never the true objective. Behind a reinforced lower-level wall, agents found what intelligence had feared but could never fully prepare them for. A concealed entrance. Concrete broke away. Steel hinges groaned. A tunnel emerged. Not a crawl space. Not a basement extension. A constructed underground corridor stretching outward with lighting, ventilation, and sound suppression. As agents advanced, weapons raised, they entered a space designed to erase human existence. Inside were 200 people. Drugged. Unconscious. Lined along walls and side chambers. Hands bound. Mouths stuffed with cloth. Each person marked with a number written directly on the skin. Inventory. Not names. Men. Women. Children. The youngest estimated under 8 years old. This was not chaos. This was order. As medics moved in to stabilize the rescued victims, search teams pressed deeper into the underground structure. Behind another false wall, agents uncovered more than 1 tons of narcotics. Heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl were sealed in industrial-grade packaging, stacked and labeled for immediate transport. The estimated black market value exceeded $400 million. Nearby, agents discovered vacuum-sealed bricks of cash. Initial counts passed $100 million within the first hour alone. At 5:05 a.m., the operation entered its final phase. The judge was located inside the tunnel complex, attempting to escape through a secondary passage while associates scrambled to collect documents and remaining cash. They failed. He was taken into custody without ceremony. Around him, 23 cartel enforcers were forced to their knees, weapons discarded, their structure collapsing in real time. By sunrise, everyone found in the tunnel was alive. Trafficking routes were severed. Access points were sealed. What the noise, fear, and confusion of the riots had hidden was now exposed with precision. The confrontation was brief. The truth it revealed would not fade. Stay with this report if you support the federal agents risking their lives to cut the arteries of this network at the ports. What investigators uncovered after securing the tunnel was not an escape strategy. It was a supply chain. If the underground passage beneath the house was where people disappeared, then maritime shipping containers were how they were erased entirely. Federal analysts later described the container system as the bloodstream of the operation. Efficient, silent, nearly invisible to routine inspection. The network relied on standard 40-foot shipping containers, identical to those moving through American ports by the tens of thousands each day. Inside, human beings were hidden behind legitimate cargo. Pallets of clothing, boxed dry foods, canned goods, shrink-wrapped consumer products. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise suspicion during a quick inspection. Each container was modified internally. False walls concealed narrow compartments. Floors were reinforced to create hidden cavities. In some cases, insulation muffled sound. In others, ventilation tubes were disguised as packaging supports. Investigators documented at least 27 altered containers tied to this single network. Each was capable of transporting 6 to 10 people at a time alongside narcotics. The drugs were never secondary. Hidden within the cargo were vacuum-sealed kilogram blocks of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. Shipping manifests showed repeating patterns. Similar weights. Identical routing. Consistent timing. Analysts conservatively estimated that more than 3 metric tons of narcotics moved through these maritime routes each year, much of it destined for distribution hubs inside the United States. The scale was staggering. Customs records revealed that containers passed through ports across 3 continents using documentation approved by compromised officials. At least 17 individuals in key positions signed off on paperwork that should have triggered secondary inspections. They didn't. The containers moved. Seals remained intact. Everything appeared routine. What made the operation especially dangerous was proximity. Some containers were temporarily staged less than 5 miles from residential neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. In one documented case, fentanyl shipments were stored overnight in a warehouse directly adjacent to a family housing complex. People and poison sat side by side, separated only by plywood and plastic wrap. Financial records confirmed that each successful container generated millions in profit. Payments were divided, delayed, and rerouted through shell companies across Asia and the Middle East before reappearing as consulting fees or logistics expenses. No single transfer looked suspicious. Together, they formed a constant river of money. For those trapped inside the containers, there was no margin for error. Transit times stretched into days. Oxygen was rationed. Medical care did not exist. Investigators later documented dehydration, respiratory distress, and chemical exposure from narcotics stored inches away from human cargo. And still, the containers moved. Federal authorities reached an unavoidable conclusion. This was not smuggling driven by desperation. It was industrial trafficking, built to scale, optimized for profit, protected by routine. The same systems used to move food and clothing around the world had been weaponized to move people and poison. By the time the tunnel was discovered, dozens of containers were already en route. Some were intercepted, others were not. That reality weighed heavily on the teams reconstructing the network. The tunnel had been shut down, but the sea, they knew, was far harder to stop. By sunrise, the raid had ended. The investigation had not. What followed was not chaos, but deliberate exposure. Federal teams resisted the urge to announce victories. Instead, they slowed everything down. Every document recovered from the tunnel. Every phone seized from the residents. Every financial transfer frozen mid-transaction was treated as part of a larger system. Investigators confirmed what many had quietly suspected. This network had not survived for years because it was clever. It had survived because the system around it had learned to look away. Within 72 hours, joint task forces launched a citywide and regional review unlike anything Minneapolis had experienced in decades. More than 1,400 shipping records were re-examined. 9 years of customs approvals were pulled from archives. Port logs, inspection waivers, and audit reports were laid side by side. Viewed individually, they meant nothing. Together, they told a story. The findings were damning. At least 17 officials across multiple sectors were flagged for direct or indirect involvement. Some accepted cash. Others received consulting fees. A few simply delayed paperwork at precisely the right moment. No single action appeared criminal on its own. Combined, they created a corridor wide enough for an empire to pass through. Financial analysts uncovered more than $380 million in transactions routed through shell companies across 3 continents. Funds were divided into amounts just below reporting thresholds. Timed to miss quarterly reviews by days, sometimes hours. In one instance, $27 million moved through 4 jurisdictions in under 36 hours, re-emerging as legitimate revenue. Scrutiny did not stop with money. Inspection schedules were audited. Patrol routes were mapped. Investigators discovered surveillance blind spots that were not accidental. Cameras failed along key transit paths. Patrols were reassigned during shipment windows. Internal emails showed requests labeled low priority that should have triggered immediate escalation. This was not negligence. It was maintenance. As subpoenas multiplied, silence began to crack. Mid-level operatives cooperated. Port clerks produced copies. Logistics managers surrendered ledgers they had been ordered to destroy. Each statement confirmed the same truth. No one at the top ever needed to give direct orders. The system already knew what to protect. For longtime residents, the revelations were disorienting. Trusted institutions unraveled quietly. Familiar names vanished from directories. Offices closed without explanation. Careers ended without press conferences or apologies. The damage was not loud. It was subtractive. By the end of the first week, more than 60 active cases were reopened. Past seizures were reclassified. Missed inspections were re-examined. Convictions tied to compromised processes were flagged for review. Events once dismissed as isolated incidents now aligned into a single continuous timeline. Federal officials described the process with a single word: unraveling. Every thread pulled exposed another. With every new disclosure, it became harder to deny what had allowed the network to survive for so long. This was not simply a failure to enforce laws. It was a failure to challenge comfort, routine, and unchecked authority. The tunnel had been sealed. The containers were under surveillance. Now the system itself was being examined. And for the first time in years, the protection that had shielded the operation was gone. Once the machinery was exposed, investigators turned to the part of the case no financial record could explain: the human cost. Behind the statistics were faces that never appeared on shipping manifests or court calendars. The 200 individuals recovered from the tunnel were not criminals in any traditional sense. They were men and women who arrived with almost nothing. No savings. No legal protection. No safety net. Many had fled war, famine, or economic collapse. Others had been promised work, shelter, or a chance to start over. What they found instead was captivity disguised as opportunity. Federal interviews revealed a pattern that repeated with unsettling consistency. Upon arrival, each person was assigned a debt, often between $25,000 and $60,000. The charges covered transportation, paperwork, and housing they never requested. The debt itself was fictional. The consequences were not. Those who questioned it were reminded that their families back home could be located. Those who resisted were isolated. Leaving was never presented as a choice. Among the group were 20 United States citizens recruited intentionally. They were selected not for strength or loyalty, but for credibility. Some were struggling with addiction. Others were unemployed or deeply in debt. They were offered fast cash to drive vehicles, translate instructions, or store packages overnight. Most were never told the full scope of the operation. By the time they understood what they were supporting, they were already implicated. The youngest victims were the hardest for investigators to document. Several children were confirmed to be under 10 years old. None had traveled voluntarily. Some were separated from parents during transit. Others had been moved alone, identified by numbers instead of names. Medical teams recorded signs of prolonged sedation, dehydration, and exposure to narcotics residue. These were not accidents. They were byproducts of efficiency. The narcotics moved alongside them left their own trail of destruction. Analysts linked the network's distribution routes to sharp increases in overdoses across multiple states. In one regional cluster, emergency room data showed fentanyl-related deaths rising by more than 300% in just 3 years. In another, methamphetamine admissions doubled, followed closely by spikes in violent crime. Communities did not collapse overnight. They eroded slowly, predictably, quietly. Social workers described neighborhoods where addiction spread faster than any response could keep pace. Elderly residents spoke of streets they no longer recognized. Parents described losing children not to violence, but to substances that arrived faster, cheaper, and more potent than ever before. Each shipment did its work without headlines. Each delivery left damage that could not be reversed. What made the harm so enduring was the sense of abandonment. Many victims believed until the very end that someone in authority would intervene. A judge, a lawyer, a city official, someone. Instead, the institutions meant to protect them had been used to control them. For the agents conducting interviews, this phase of the investigation carried a different weight. Firefights ended quickly. Evidence could be cataloged. But listening to victims describe weeks spent underground, days without sunlight, or the moment they realized escape was impossible left marks no debrief could address. This was not collateral damage. It was the product. The system extracted value from desperation and discarded what it could no longer use. The people who suffered most were not those who moved money or approved documents. They were the ones who trusted the wrong authority at the wrong time. As federal teams compiled testimony, one conclusion became unavoidable. The success of the network did not depend only on violence or deception. It depended on silence. The silence of fear. The silence of routine. The silence of a system that had stopped asking who was being harmed. By the time the victims were freed, years had already been taken from them. Some would never fully recover. Others would carry the memory of numbered skin and sealed walls for the rest of their lives. And for a city just beginning to understand what had been hidden beneath it, the realization was devastating. The greatest damage had occurred long before anyone knew where to look. When the last evidence trucks departed and the federal perimeter came down, Minneapolis did not celebrate. There were no speeches, no parades, no relief. What settled over the city instead was heavier. A quiet reckoning. Within 48 hours of the raid, the effects were visible. Financial transfers linked to the network froze. Freight schedules collapsed. Warehouses that had operated nightly went dark. Federal analysts confirmed that more than 70% of known distribution routes tied to the operation fell silent almost immediately. Dealers vanished. Couriers stopped answering phones. The machinery that had moved people and poison for years had lost its protection. Hospitals noticed first. In the 30 days following the operation, emergency departments across the metropolitan area reported nearly a 40% drop in fentanyl-related overdose admissions. Street-level seizures declined as well, not because enforcement slowed, but because supply had been severed. For the first time in years, officers encountered fewer packages, fewer weapons, fewer desperate people willing to take the risk. But the quiet came with consequences. As federal warrants expanded, familiar names disappeared from offices and letterheads. Departments were placed under review. Entire units were reassigned. Dozens of past cases were reopened after investigators flagged compromised inspections and delayed filings. Some convictions were paused. Others were vacated entirely. The legal system, once assumed stable, began examining its own foundation. Public trust eroded quickly. Longtime residents, many of them retirees who had lived in the same neighborhoods for decades, watched press briefings with disbelief. They recognized the streets, the buildings, the institutions. What they struggled to accept was that corruption had not arrived suddenly. It had been living comfortably among them. Community meetings filled within hours. Questions came faster than answers. How long had this been happening? Who knew? Who benefited? Why were warnings missed? Officials spoke carefully. Investigators avoided speculation. But the numbers spoke clearly. The network had operated for nearly a decade. Hundreds of people trafficked. Thousands of kilograms of narcotics moved, all while passing through systems designed to stop it. For city leadership, the damage was personal. Approval ratings dropped sharply. Internal emails surfaced. Decisions once defended as pragmatic were now seen as reckless. Calls for oversight grew louder. Independent reviews were announced. Some resignations followed quietly, without statements or explanations. The emotional toll extended beyond politics. Families who had reported missing relatives weeks earlier came forward with renewed urgency. Some received answers. Others did not. Social service agencies, already stretched thin, were overwhelmed with requests for counseling, housing, and medical care. Elderly residents spoke openly of fear. Not fear of crime alone, but fear of not knowing who could still be trusted. Federal officials remained measured. They did not call the operation a victory. They called it a correction. What the city was experiencing, they explained, was the aftershock of accountability. When a system removes its internal shield, collapse is not dramatic. It is systemic. Routes close. Money stops moving. Influence evaporates. And the vacuum left behind forces institutions to rebuild or be replaced. In the weeks that followed, oversight expanded. Data sharing protocols tightened. Joint task forces became permanent. Quiet cooperation was replaced with scrutiny that left little room to hide. Transparency, once treated as a burden, became unavoidable. No one claimed the city was healed. Too many lives had already been disrupted. Too many years lost to addiction, fear, and silence. The scars remained visible. In empty storefronts. In reopened files. In families waiting for answers that might never come. But something fundamental had shifted. The belief that power, reputation, or routine could shield wrongdoing was broken. The system, shaken but awake, began defending itself again. And for a city that came closer than anyone realized to losing control entirely, that change mattered. The network was gone. The noise had faded. What remained was responsibility, and the knowledge that ignoring it once had nearly cost everything.